Again, thank you all for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for coming on this important occasion. I want to talk about evidence-based school threat assessment, and particularly I'll talk about a model that my colleagues and I developed about 18 years ago that we've been doing research on since then, and its potential value in not just preventing violence in schools, but preventing violence in general. The main points I want to make is, first of all, that our decisions about school safety have to be based on a careful analysis of the facts and not just be driven by fears and emotions, however important they are. And to recognize that school violence is a small part of a much larger problem of gun violence. It would be a terrible mistake to assume that the only problem that we have is in our schools. And finally, I want to say that we need to place much more emphasis on prevention than on security. And one prevention strategy is evidence-based school threat assessment. Now, certainly school shootings have had a terribly traumatic effect on the survivors, their family members, and all of us as a society who've had to witness this and think about this and contemplate it. But one of the effects of these shootings is to convince us somehow that we need to turn our schools into fortresses, that we must spend billions of dollars on security measures. And what I want to suggest to you that that's missing the total picture, the larger picture, and can lead us in the wrong way. We have really two processes going on. We have a process of recovery from trauma, which is very important and must be cared for the individuals such as Lauren, who are here with us so bravely today. But we also have to have a process of stepping back from the trauma and saying, what is the most effective, efficient thing that we can do to keep our young people safe, and keep them safe not only in school, but out of school? I'm sure many people have seen the charts like this that tally up how many shootings we've had in schools, and it's horrendous to think that there's been over 300 shootings since the Sandy Hook shooting. But I think this chart leaves out something very important, which is how many shootings we've had outside of schools as well. And if you do a little digging with CDC National Vital Statistics data, you'll find, like me, that in the last 5 years, we've averaged over 100,000 shootings every year. We've had 500,000 shootings in which someone was killed or injured outside of our schools. And from that perspective, for every shooting in a school, we have 1,600 shootings outside of schools. So I'm interested in keeping our young people safe in our schools, but also in our communities. We average about 22 young people who are killed at school every year over the past 20 years. But we average over 1,000 young people who are killed outside of school. Even if we spent the billions of dollars that business people tell us it would take to make our schools absolutely impregnable, that would stop only less than 0.1% of the shootings that take place. Let me suggest to you that if we put a policeman in every single school, we might stop one shooting in one building. But if we put another counselor in that school, we have the potential to help young people long before they go down the pathway to violence and to prevent shootings all across our community. The real problem is gun violence, not school violence. When we look at where gun violence occurs, where homicides occur, some colleagues and I looked at FBI statistics on where homicides occur across the country. They occur in people's homes, on the street, parking lots, garage, outdoors, and way down at the bottom of the list are schools. Schools are actually one of the safest places in our community, and we certainly want to keep our kids safe in school, and we want to make our schools safer. But let me point out that restaurants have 10 times as many shootings, homicides, as do our schools. So anyone who recommends that we need to arm our teachers, logically should be advocating that we need to arm our cooks and servers too, and put our metal detectors up in the entrance of our schools, because those places are 10 times more dangerous than our schools. We have to do more than just security. We cannot turn every public space, every open area into a fortress. After the Sandy Hook shooting, the business folks told us that schools spent about $5 billion on security measures. Finally, that wasn't enough, and maybe it would never be enough. We need to recognize that when that $5 billion goes into security measures, school budgets are not elastic. That money has to come from somewhere. And what we often see, and what I've seen in school systems, if they have to cut back on their student support services, on their anti-bullying programs, on their counseling and mental health services, because the money is going to security measures. The other negative reaction we have to the fear of school violence is an increase in the use of zero-tolerance discipline, the idea that we have to get tough and send a strong message by kicking kids out of school. And since the school shootings, since Columbine, we've seen a ratcheting up of suspension policies, of exclusionary discipline that has had documented negative effects in driving up juvenile dropout rates, juvenile court rates, and of course the school to prison pipeline. We need to be very careful that we don't react to school shootings by making the problem worse, by using exclusionary discipline that drives up our dropout rate and our rate of kids becoming involved in crime. We need to prevent shootings instead of simply preparing for them. Security measures are largely preparation for a shooting, but we need to think about stopping shootings. And prevention means to keep something from happening. So we need to think that prevention has to start long before there's a gunman at your door, long before there's a gunman in your parking lot. Who is that person before he picked up the gun? Who is that person when they were in high school, middle school, elementary school? And what could we have done differently to have diverted them from that pathway to violence? Well, 20 years ago, actually, law enforcement, the FBI and the Secret Service, working with the U.S. Department of Education, recommended the use of threat assessment in schools. Well, this was a very unfamiliar concept. We weren't really sure what it meant, but a group of colleagues and I, as well as others around the country, have been busy trying to adapt threat assessment to apply it to schools. It's not the same as what is originally done in law enforcement for assassins and terrorists. It's for kids. It's for kids who make threats. And we know that kids make threats a lot. Mostly they don't mean them. They're in a developmental phase. They're immature. But we also know that some threats are serious. And so we need a process. And threat assessment in schools is a process, a problem-solving approach to violence prevention that involves both assessment and intervention, working with young people who have made a threat or seem distressed in some way that raises concern about violence. It begins when people care about one another in the school, when family members, friends, teachers recognize that someone is unhappy, alienated, withdrawn, resentful, maybe engages in some type of threatening statement, that a threat assessment team can look at the situation, assess the seriousness of the threat, and decide what kind of appropriate interventions, actions, supports ought to be implemented. We know that threat assessment has to begin with identifying someone who's in need, who's in distress, maybe who's made a threat, and then evaluating, recognizing that all threats are not equal, they're not all equally serious. We don't want to overreact to student threats that are not serious, and then follow through with intervention. Well, we developed a set of threat assessment guidelines, and we field tested them and disseminated them and have 17 years and 11 studies evaluating their outcomes. We know that schools need to avoid overreacting to threats that are not serious. Probably the chief example of that is this poor young boy who chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. And under the school's zero-tolerance policy, they suspended him from school. Now, the only thing dangerous about this young boy's behavior is what he ate. Let me just say that we also have to avoid, of course, the opposite error of underreaction in a truly serious case. And we've seen throughout the country more school shootings have been prevented, have been averted than have taken place. And we know that they have been prevented largely because someone came forward and said, I'm concerned about something he said or did that raised concern. And there were school authorities who listened and who were responsive, who took the threat seriously, who investigated it, and took appropriate action. In threat assessment, we try to determine why the student made a threat so that we can prevent it from being carried out. Now, I mentioned that we've done a lot of studies. I'll spend the next 3 hours now going through each of our studies and and I'm sure I'll have your rapt attention for them. I'll be happy to send you copies of any of these. They're available from our website, the Virginia Youth Violence Project. Just Google us. But let me summarize. Let me give you the thumbnail elevator summary of our research, which is that across our studies, 99% of threats are not carried out. The 1% that carried out involved no shootings, stabbings, or homicides. They were fights, they were assaults with no serious injury. We also know that schools using threat assessment don't administer harsh consequences except in very extreme cases. Only 1% of the cases result in a student being expelled. Only 1% resulted in an arrest. And in fact, those schools show a decline in the use of suspension. And we also see that racial disparities in those schools are reduced or absent. Our most current study found that there were no differences between black, white, and Hispanic students in the rate in which they were suspended or expelled. They also use counseling more often and have a positive school climate. Well, at any rate, let me wrap up by saying that after the Sandy Hook shooting, Virginia actually mandated threat assessment in all of its schools. We found that threat assessment does need to be adapted, but it can be a process that avoids and minimizes criminalizing students and can provide help to students. All of this and a larger perspective on youth violence prevention is contained in an 8-point plan that many of us who were here devised after the Parkland shooting. And this plan has gun control, it has school climate improvement, it has threat assessment, and it has improved mental health services for young people. You can obtain this from our website. I won't read through all of it. My concluding points are, first of all, that school violence is a small part of a much larger problem that we need to address comprehensively. Schools are much safer than the public actually believes and safer than it feels. But that threat assessment is one important tool, one of many, that we can use in schools to respond to student threats and prevent violence both in schools and in communities. Thanks very much.